Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is David Biet. I'm the director of the Canada Institute here, and it's my pleasure on behalf of the Center to welcome you. For those of you who have never been here, the Woodrow Wilson Center is the United States memorial to President Wilson, our only president with a PhD. Wilson felt strongly that the public policy world ought to speak with academics and vice versa, and that's what we do here, dialogue. And in that context, with the Canada Institute, I try to encourage dialogue on Canada-U.S. issues among the policy audience in Washington with scholars. And in Canada, we try to bring an American perspective to bilateral relations to round out the discussion there. It's a pleasure today to join with Accenture and the Network on North American Studies. And someone has their cell phone on. We're recording this, so if you've got your cell phone or BlackBerry on, it will make those beeps when a call or something is coming in, so please try to turn them off. For this study on the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, Accenture stepped up to the plate and funded the study and worked with the Network on North American Studies, and these folks are here today to discuss the publication. We have some people come in to discuss with the authors their views of the publication, and it's been a great working with them. There was a meeting on Monday in Ottawa similar to this, and perhaps there'll be one in Mexico later. But I will not talk too long. I will turn it over to Michael Hawes, who is the Executive Director of the Foundation for Educational Exchange between Canada and the United States, the Canada-U.S. Fulbright Program. Michael.
Thank you. Well, thank you, David, and thank you once again for welcoming me here. I can tell you this isn't the first time I've been in this room, and this isn't the first time I have worked with the Canada Institute, but it's always a pleasure. This is a great crowd. Thank you all for coming on this warmish May morning. My role, as David said, is the Executive Director of the Foundation for Educational Exchange between Canada and the United States of America. I am a political science professor from Queen's University and a specialist in Canada-U.S. relations, so I feel a particular sympathy for and interest in this topic. The Foundation for Educational Exchange is a binational treaty-based organization whose primary mission is to run the Canada-U.S. Fulbright Program. In doing that, what we have found is that there has been a significant need for and a clear interest in policy discussions in Canada, allowing us to encourage Canadians to take a deeper and we hope more nuanced appreciation of politics and public affairs and social life and intellectual life in the United States. And in the process, perhaps we'll shed a little bit more light on the relationship and detract some of the heat. I'm not sure that's going to happen today, but that's my hope. The Network on North American Studies was a creation of the Foundation designed to support the Fulbright Program and to support our mission. It is a network made up of leading-edge universities, the University of British Columbia, the University of Alberta, Calgary, the University of Montreal, the University of Toronto, the University of Prince Edward Island, Carleton, the University of Western Ontario. So as you can see, it is a national network, coast to coast, involving leading-edge researchers, scholars, students, think tanks, and government officials. Government officials in both countries have been working with us and supporting this initiative, and we have put together an ongoing program designed to address key public policy issues. This particular issue comes out of a discussion that I had with Gail Nix, who I'll introduce in just a moment, at Accenture. When we were discussing the possibility of working together, it was clear to us that we had some common interests, and those were simply to encourage people to think more thoughtful, to give some more thought to this particular topic. Last year, when we had a discussion here in Washington, well, up in Reston, which is sort of near Washington, as I found out last night, it's much farther than I remember, especially if you go through Falls Church 3 times. But anyway, we decided to work together on this project. We engaged some academic experts who in turn did a series of interviews and an extensive amount of research and came up with the report that we are releasing here in Washington today. We did indeed release it at the National Conference Center on Monday in Ottawa to another packed house. We had representatives there on the panel from the Canadian Border Security Agency and from the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. So there's an opportunity at that event for the Canadian delegates to respond directly to the paper. And we have in the process got a lot of take-up from the media, which is not unimportant in the sense that it reminds us that this is an issue that matters to people on both sides of the border in all parts of both countries. It is, as the authors will undoubtedly tell you, not a government-to-government issue. It's an issue about peoples in North America. And I think the reason they called this people, what do they call it? People, Security, and Borders, I'm kidding, is because it is indeed in the first instance about people. It is my pleasure to introduce Gail Nix, who will moderate the discussion and introduce the panelists to you. She's a recognized expert with extensive experience in border management, identity management, and security. She is a dual national, has worked and occupied senior positions in the Government of Canada, and currently is the Executive Director of the Immigration, Justice, and Public Safety Practice at Accenture here in Washington, D.C. Yep.
Sneak by you there, Michael. Thank you. Thank you, David, for hosting us here. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you to our authors and our panel members for joining us, and thank you, Michael, for the introductions. As Michael mentioned, last year I was speaking at a conference on security up in Canada, and a few of the members of his team came up to me and said, we should talk about Fulbright Foundation. And I had the opportunity then to learn a little bit more about the Fulbright Foundation and the important work they do in the world of academia. I'll allow these people to get a moment to get their seats. As a result of that conversation and as a result of understanding a little more about the Fulbright Foundation, Michael and I got together and we started talking about a number of the border issues between Canada and the U.S., and we settled on the question of the WHTI initiative, and the result is the paper on people, security, and borders and the impact of WHTI on North America. At the heart of the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative is really the question of security, the realities of three nations, Canada, U.S., and Mexico, that border each other. And there is some historical uniqueness to our relationships. With Canada, we're talking about a border that for the extensive historical period was called the largest undefended border in the world. With Mexico, we're dealing with a different scenario where we're talking about the question of Mexicans, undocumented, trying to come into the United States to find a better way of life. Very different scenarios, but the same security and facilitation issues. However, since 9/11, the perspectives have changed. Governments have come under considerable pressure to secure our borders against not only terrorism, but smuggling, theft, drug trafficking, and other illegal acts. The pressure led to the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, which was passed into law in 2004. The law requires that all travelers carry either a valid passport or another secured and validated document when traveling to the U.S. from the Western Hemisphere. The passport requirement for air went into effect, as you know, in January of 2007. The land and sea borders will be impacted by June of 2009. The white paper highlights the challenges of balancing the tighter border security with controls while facilitating the flow of people and trade, balancing the dual objectives of security and prosperity. For governments, the issue is determining and implementing appropriate technologies to achieve the right mix of security and efficiency. With over $1.5 billion of trade crossing our borders daily, our prosperity and those of our neighbors is dependent on us doing this appropriately. Governments are also dealing with the question of how to ensure an acceptable balance between security and the fundamental right to privacy. And they will also have to deal with the challenges caused by WHTI, such as the increased demand for passports. We were just briefly speaking about the fact that this year the State Department will issue somewhere in the range of 17.5 million passports, up about 5.5 million from last year. The Canadian Passport Agency is also seeing a deluge of requests in passports. At the current time, though, there's little information available on the cost of implementation or the possible economic impacts of the WHTI. When we consider that there are somewhere between 400 and 500 million border crossings annually, gaining an understanding of how this will be implemented and the possible impacts is critical. On a smaller scale, there's the consideration of border communities who are dependent on living and cross-border shopping. I go to a movie in your town, you come to a hockey game in my town. What is the impact on the ability to continue this lifestyle and to support the livelihoods of those areas? For individual citizens, it comes down to knowledge. Do they even know about this, and do they understand it? Unless you're a regular international traveler, and even if you live in one of those cross-border communities, most citizens and residents are not aware of the need for the authorized documentation. And the lack of citizen awareness and understanding about this initiative will at best cause a high degree of uncertainty, and at worst will have economic impacts and consequences. If individuals are aware and do plan to travel, there's also the question of how much will it cost, and how easy will it be for me to acquire the secure approved documents. The decisions and perceptions at each level will have profound implications for this debate, and our authors have presented some valuable information and insights on these topics. While the process of crossing borders is forever changed, a healthy spirit of cooperation between our nations can help achieve a higher level of security and facilitation. Personally, I did find the paper's conclusions compelling. We're very pleased at the work the authors have done and the Fulbright Foundation, along with the network of North American studies. I believe we have met our goal in creating a thought-provoking document that provides accurate information and will, in fact, help educate the debate on this important topic. Now allow me to introduce our authors and our panel, and we'll hear more about this topic. First, we'll be starting with Dr. Donald Abelson. Dr. Abelson is a professor and chair of political science, as well as director of the Center for American Studies at the University of Western Ontario. He specializes in American politics and U.S. foreign policy. He received his PhD from Queen's University in 1993. In addition to his research and teaching interests, Dr. Abelson has also served as a consultant for several government and non-governmental agencies in North America and Europe, including the Institute on Research on Public Policy, the North-South Institute, the Center for International Private Enterprise, the World Bank Institute, and the Ontario Ministry of Economic Development and Trade. Dr. Abelson is a noted author of several books, and his works have appeared in edited collections and academic journals. His commentaries on a wide range of political issues have also appeared in newspapers, public opinion magazines, and government publications. Dr. Abelson.
Thank you very much, Gail, and my thanks to Michael Hawes of the Canada-U.S. Fulbright Foundation and David Biet of the Woodrow Wilson Center and their respective staffs for arranging this special event. I'm delighted to be here today and to have an opportunity to talk about a very important and timely, not to mention policy-relevant issue. I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank the many people in Washington, and I thank them in Ottawa, people in government and non-governmental organizations, people in the private sector, who took the time out of their very hectic schedules to share their insights about the WHTI with Duncan and myself. Without their input, without their knowledge, without their expertise, we would not have been able to produce this report. As many of you will discover later today when you make your way through the written report, a lot of it is technical. A lot of information you have to go over several times to get a sense of what people are really talking about. And again, without the expertise and insight that people in this city were prepared to provide, we would not have been able to do it. So my thanks to you. Let me preface my remarks by saying that it was not our intention in writing this report to fuel the political debate around WHTI. As tempting as that would have been for two political scientists with too much time on their hands, it was a temptation that we certainly tried to avoid. Our intention was to produce a report that would highlight the many issues surrounding WHTI, to obviously focus on the security dimension, but also to take into consideration other very important issues that have been raised over the last number of months about the implementation of WHTI, and I'm going to focus on many of those today. As students of international relations, we all understand probably too well that the primary responsibility of each sovereign state is to provide for its national security. It's the first thing that we learn as students of international affairs. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that after the attacks of 9/11, that the United States government felt compelled to think of various measures to better secure the homeland. And in the weeks and months following 9/11, policymakers on Capitol Hill, in the White House, and throughout the bureaucracy met to discuss how to deal with the events of 9/11 and how to create a smarter and more secure border. In securing the border, policymakers in the United States and in Canada recognize the long-standing relationship between the two countries. Gail made reference to the fact that the 5,600-mile border that we share up until 9/11 was the longest undefended border in the world. And there was a realization that although this was a source of pride for policymakers for many, many years, 9/11 changed all of that. That instead of looking at it with a source of pride, it became a source of concern, perhaps a source of vulnerability, and something that had to be addressed. Let me make this point very, very clear in our report and in this presentation, that both the Canadian and American governments share a commitment to establishing a smart and secure border, and one that does not unnecessarily interfere with the free flow of goods, services, and people. Again, in writing this report, it was not our intention to pit one government against another. They are both on the same page. They might have policy differences with respect to implementation and the ramifications of WHTI, but they certainly share a commitment to establishing and strengthening the border in such a way as to facilitate the free movement of goods, services, and people. As Gail pointed out, the first phase of WHTI has gone by relatively smoothly. It was implemented for travelers by air on January 23rd, 2007. This did not come as a huge shock, in large part because the vast majority of business travelers already carry a passport. So the first phase, the implementation of WHTI, went very well. The concern over the last number of months has been what is going to happen at the land border crossings, 140 land border crossings dotting the 49th parallel, when that phase of the WHTI is implemented as late as June 09, or I should say as early as June 09. What we've tried to do is to highlight some of the important issues surrounding the debate, above and beyond security, but clearly security factors prominently into our discussion. And let me just touch on these very, very briefly, and then we'll move on to other points. One of the issues that has been raised, obviously, is about technology. What impact can technology have in establishing a smarter border? And there's been a lot of discussion about biometric technologies, electronic fingerprinting, retinal scanning, and other types of technologies that can be introduced at border crossings, not only to facilitate the movement of people, but to help verify the identity of the people crossing the border. As Michael pointed out, about 500 people or 500 million crossings take place across the Canada-U.S. border each year, 400 million through land crossings alone. A large part of the problem as it stands is that over 8,000 different types of identity documents are being used to cross the Canada-U.S. border. Documents ranging from hunting and fishing licenses to birth certificates and baptismal certificates. 8,000 different types of documents. So it makes perfect sense to try and reduce the number of documents that Customs and Border officials have to look at while determining whether or not people should be able to cross the border. Biometric technologies, we've concluded, can be very, very useful in terms of identity management. One of the obstacles that we pointed out was it was going to be very difficult for the United States government and certainly for the Canadian government to verify the authenticity of foundation documents used in foreign countries to obtain passports. So although biometric technologies can be extremely useful in terms of verifying the identity of the person standing across the table from you, there's going to have to be considerable cooperation among foreign governments to determine how to establish a more transparent process for understanding how foundation documents are used in foreign countries to obtain passports. And that's something that more consideration must be given to. The economic impact, and this is something certainly policymakers in Canada have been very concerned about, as have many representatives, senators, and members of the U.S. House of Representatives from border states. What is the economic impact going to be of the WHTI? How is it going to affect spontaneous tourism? And as you know, there's between $1.3 and $1.5 billion in two-way trade between the two countries every day. And a concern expressed by many interest groups and policymakers is, will the implementation of WHTI deter people, Americans crossing the border into Canada, Canadians crossing the border into the United States? One of the reports that we were able to access, and there are very few reports on this, was produced by the Conference Board of Canada last year. The Conference Board of Canada, a very well-respected institute in Ottawa, concluded that between 2005 and 2010, the Canadian tourism industry could expect to lose approximately $3.5 billion. For the Americans, it would be about $2 billion in the tourism industry alone. These concerns have been expressed again by policymakers in northern border states, by Senator Clinton, Louis Slaughter, and others, and certainly this is a concern that has been taken up by interest groups on both sides of the border, and something that we have to think about. As far as we know, we could not get a U.S. government-sponsored economic impact analysis of WHTI. In Canada, there are very few, but this is something that has to be done so we do understand the implications of this particular initiative. Privacy, something you're going to hear a lot about today, and the relationship between biometric technologies and privacy. One of the concerns that has been raised is about the possibility of RFID chips, radio frequency identity chips, being embedded either in U.S. pass cards or, let's say, in an enhanced driver's license, and the possibility that the information contained on that card could be used by third parties, could be used by border officials to discriminate against people entering either Canada or the United States. A few things that you have to understand about RFID technology. One of the things is that a third party who accesses information on that particular card would only be provided with a reference number, a meaningless reference number that can later then be used by a customs or border official to access an integrated database. So the concern about third parties driving by customs and border officials with equipment that would allow them to tap into your RFID chip, the only thing they would be able to obtain would be a reference number. There are valid concerns about privacy. Certainly, firms in the private sector and in government are thinking long and hard about how to best secure confidential information, and this is going to be an ongoing debate, not only in Canada and the United States, but in Mexico as well. Infrastructure. What type of investment do we have to make in infrastructure in order to support the implementation of WHTI? One of the things that I noticed crossing the Blue Water Bridge in Sarnia, Ontario about a week ago was that although there was a specially designated lane going from Sarnia into Michigan for people who were members of the Nexus program, for low-risk business travelers, there was not a single car on it. All the cars were on the right side of the bridge, obviously people who weren't members of Nexus trying to cross the border. One of the things that we have to think long and hard about is how to encourage more people to join programs like this. And you really do need a critical mass of people who are going to be able to take advantage or should take advantage of designated lanes in airports, on roads, in order to facilitate the movement of people. The last thing we want to do is to create more congestion at the border. The whole idea is to try and facilitate the movement of goods and people. Programs such as FAST for truck drivers, allowing them to cross the border a lot faster, are incredibly important, especially for businesses that focus on just-in-time delivery. They cannot afford to wait at the border for a long period of time. They have to be able to cross with their goods in hand. Governments on both sides of the border have to think more critically about the type of infrastructure that's going to be required in order to establish a safe and secure border. And we touch on that as well. And in the final section of the report with respect to policy recommendations, we encourage policymakers to work very closely with those in the private sector and in the academic community to determine the type of infrastructure that would be required and the costs that would have to be absorbed. And finally, I just wanted to touch a bit on public education, which has become a very important part of the WHTI debate. There was a poll taken by Zogby International in 2006. They have since taken another poll. In 2006, though, they concluded, and the poll focused on people living in border states, that about 87% of Americans were either not familiar or only somewhat familiar with the WHTI. Canadians didn't do that much better. Again, this was mid-February, or this was February '06. 82% of Canadians at the time either were not familiar or only slightly familiar with the requirements of WHTI. Passport applications have increased incredibly on both sides of the border. Clearly, the message is getting across. A recent Zogby poll has indicated that far more people now are aware of the requirements under WHTI, but this is something that we have to continue to work at in order to ensure that people can cross efficiently. Let me conclude by saying that the WHTI debate has the potential to pit one government against another, to pit different interest groups against others. It's a very important debate, it's a timely debate, and it's very important that we begin to shed light on some of the issues surrounding it. There are policymakers in Canada and the United States who have said repeatedly that they share a commitment to security. The important thing is that they have a secure border, a safe border, but one that does not interfere with the special relationship the two countries have shared for many years, which to a large extent has been based on prosperity. And if they're able to achieve that balance between safety, security, and prosperity, WHTI will have a much easier time of being implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. And Don has given us an interesting perspective from the Canadian perspective. I, as mentioned by Michael, do have dual citizenship. I grew up in upstate New York, and I actually lived in Ottawa, Canada for 18 years with my husband. And one of the things I did frequently was drive between Ottawa and upstate New York, a 3.5-hour drive, and sit in those lines. So hopefully the reduction of documentation that those border control guards on both sides of the border have to look at, moving it from 8,000 to a couple of validated documents, will help reduce those lines that I sat in. Now, to bring us a little different perspective, we have Dr. Duncan Wood. And Duncan received his BA in Honours in Politics from Leicester University in the UK in 1989. His MA in Political Science from McMaster University in Canada in 1990, and his PhD in Political Science from Queen's University, Canada in 1996. Since 1996, he's been teaching and researching at the ETAM in Mexico City, where he directs Canadian Studies programs, and since January 2001 has been the director of the undergraduate program in International Relations. Dr. Wood's research focuses on the reform of Mexican energy sector, political economy of the international finance, Canadian, British, and Mexican foreign policy, and in particular, in recent years, Canada-Mexico relations. Dr. Wood is director of consulting company called Think Mexico, providing services to foreign and national firms in Mexico and Latin America contexts. And he is also a noted author with several books and publications. And he was the navigator last night that took them through Falls Church 3 times to get to Reston.
I like the place. It's beautiful.
Dr. Woods?
Many thanks. I'm going to stay seated because I have some slides to put up on the screen that should help to guide us through, I hope. There we go. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to echo the thanks and appreciation, and particularly like to thank our host, David, today. Thank you very much. Did an excellent job of putting this together. And it's very, very nice to be here, finally. I've never actually been here before. It's terrific. Congratulations to Gail. In your introduction, you used the term undocumented Mexicans as opposed to illegal Mexican migrants, which we're all very sensitive about south of the border. And that leads me to a question. Are there any Mexicans in the room? Thank you. Wonderful. I was very concerned when I saw the list of participants that nobody had confirmed from the Mexican embassy or from any kind of Mexican academic institution, and I thought that it reflected the real lack of interest south of the border that I've encountered with regards to WHTI. And largely that is because the public perception, the official perception, is that this is not about us at all. This is not about Mexico. That ours is a very, very different border, that we already meet all of the requirements for WHTI through our visas that Mexicans have to enter the United States. And so this isn't going to change our reality at all. In terms of the bilateral relationship, this is not a priority issue. Of course, migration and other border issues such as the environment, investment on the border are much more pressing for Mexico. And therefore, you know, at one point I encountered this quote that, well, for Mexico, WHTI comes in around number 17 as an issue on the bilateral agenda, i.e. not really anywhere. And generally I encountered not just a lack of interest, but a lack of awareness. In conducting interviews at the very beginning, when Michael first invited me to participate, I must admit I said, could you explain that to me? And then I thought, well, I'll go and find some of my friends who are experts on migration, on the border, on bilateral relations. And I brought up the term Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. I said WHTI. I even said WHTI. And people said to me, ¿de qué se trata eso? So what's that all about? And I thought, well, it's obviously just the bizarre English accent again. But once I'd explained it, people said, no, still not getting you. Still haven't got a clue. And I found this not just amongst experts, but amongst public officials as well. When I did eventually encounter some people who knew some details about WHTI, the response was, well, this really is not about us. And so the lack of awareness that I encountered and the lack of interest made me question whether it was really worth including Mexico in this study at all. And then I began to ask different kinds of questions. I began to question, okay, so how is this going to impact upon the border itself? Thank you, Doug. And what I encountered was that there is a potentially highly negative impact to be faced on the U.S.-Mexico border, on the Mexican side. The impact here is not on Mexicans traveling. I want to emphasize that. Mexicans who travel in a documented fashion to the United States will not be affected. Mexicans who travel in an undocumented fashion to the United States will not be affected by WHTI.
Not necessarily.
So I'll leave that up to you, Kathleen, to fill us in on. However, there is the potential for a serious disruption in border life, in border communities on the Mexican side. And the reason why I think it's important to bring this up is that what I fear is that there will be a temporary interruption in U.S. citizens traveling to Mexico, to border towns for shopping, for drinking, for day tourism, to buy pharmaceutical products and other products that could be classified as pharmaceutical products. And that disruption holds a potential threat not just for Mexico but also for the U.S., something I'll elaborate on in a little while. First of all, I'd like to focus on the question of tourism. This year, 2007, once Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative came into force for airport entries into Mexico, the Mexican Tourism Secretary, Rodolfo Elizondo, has estimated that up to 2.2% of total revenues will be affected by the initiative, that up to 318,000 passengers will cancel or fail to book trips to Mexico because they don't have the necessary travel documents, and that this would amount to a loss of over $250 million in tourist revenue. Now, $250 million, it's a lot to me. It's not a great deal in terms of the overall amount of tourism income that comes into Mexico. But in a country where unemployment, low wages, underemployment are a seemingly intractable problem, I think it's worth pointing out that this is going to have an impact upon people's lives, particularly at a time when the Calderon government has identified employment and more broadly based prosperity as a priority for his mandate. Now that's what the Mexican Tourism Secretary has estimated, and he very much underplayed it. He said it's only 2.2% of total income. And I thought, well, 2.2% matters. It really does matter if you're one of the people who is affected by it. The World Travel and Tourism Council conducted a study, and they estimated that up to 95,000 tourist sector jobs may be in jeopardy this year because of the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative and the fact that U.S. citizens will cancel or fail to book trips to Mexico. That impact upon Mexican tourism because of the new regulations at the airport will be a temporary thing. People will, of course, get passports, and a lot of airline travelers already have their passports. What I'm really worried about is the impact upon day tourism once the new regulations are implemented at the land crossings. Whether it's in 2008 or 2009, there will be a transitional period. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a year, where you'll see a disruption of the in the number of U.S. citizens crossing over to Mexico. And my nightmare scenario, and that's why I have this lovely little picture of Avenida Revolucion in Tijuana, my nightmare scenario is Avenida Revolucion deserted on a Friday night. Those of us who have visited and enjoyed the pleasures of Tijuana will know that on a Friday night it's full of Americans, and it's full of Americans who come largely from colleges, universities, who go across because, hey, why not? It's fun. It's a good time to go across to Tijuana. College students, university students, I don't really see them getting themselves organized to get a passport in order to go across and start drinking on a Friday night. At least not the first time. Now, of course, they don't need a passport or the pass card to get into Mexico. They'll be able to get into Mexico quite easily. It's getting back, and it's going through the inspection that will take place as they get to the border. According to U.S. law, of course, they cannot be denied entry into the United States if they can prove that they are U.S. citizens. And they will get back into the United States if they don't have a passport. The problem is going from the first inspection to secondary inspection, which could involve any number of unpleasant measures, which an 18-year-old male university student may not be interested in pursuing with the border crossing guard. Now, the potential for people to have their travel plans disrupted in that way is very real, I feel. And what would be the sort of the next step after that? Imagine a group of college kids going over to Tijuana or any other of the border towns on a Friday night, having that unpleasant experience on the way back. Well, rationally, they'd say, right, I'm going to get my passport. Or are they going to say, I don't want to go there again? Or are they going to say, I will get my passport, and then don't do it, and then they say, well, let's just stay in San Diego tonight. And that's the potential is, I think, to see a great loss of income. Now, the reaction that I got from some U.S. officials in Mexico when I brought this up was to say very straightforwardly, well, that isn't the kind of tourism that Mexico wants. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, they don't really want people coming across and getting drunk and trying drugs and maybe engaging in all kinds of other illicit activities. And I said, well, that's an interesting point of view. Maybe Mexico doesn't want that. Maybe it's not good for Mexico, but the lives of people who depend upon that industry will be deeply affected by this. It doesn't really matter what we think morally of prostitution, drugs, or alcohol. The fact is that in northern Mexico, people's lives depend upon that. And what does that mean for the economy and for the communities up there? And here's where I see the equation sort of turning back on itself onto the United States. A severe, albeit temporary, negative impact upon the border economy on the Mexican side will see a knock-on effect onto security, onto public security initially. On an already fragile border where questions of drug trafficking, where questions of the gun trade, where questions of violence are already very, very pressing, I think that this is an issue that both Mexico and the United States need to focus on more intensely, to say, how is this going to impact upon life on the border? How's it going to impact upon security? And how is it going to impact, ultimately, upon U.S. citizens living on our side of the border? Thank you. Having said that about the potential negative impact upon Mexico and then back onto the United States, I'd like to focus on some of the potentially positive impacts that Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative will have on the two borders of North America as we now see them, and also upon a third border. Well, clearly there is the potential to make the borders more efficient. As Don and Gail have pointed out, there is the potential to simplify things at the border. The use of technology should, hopefully, make things quicker, smoother at the border. What have we seen in terms of a spillover effect onto Mexican-U.S. relations? Well, whereas the Canada-U.S. relationship has gone through some very, very rocky times because of Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, speaking to various officials, they were saying that it takes up to 50% of their time right now in terms of bilateral relations. Mexico is now seen as the reliable partner. Hey, there's a novelty. Borders, Mexico, reliability. It's not usually seen in those terms. This is something entirely new. Mexico is enjoying its status as being the NAFTA partner that you don't have to worry about on this particular border issue. And it has actually led to closer cooperation between U.S. and Mexican authorities, in particularly between Department of Homeland Security up here and the Secretaría de Gobernación and Seguridad Pública in Mexico. And interestingly enough, we're seeing a spillover effect to the southern border. The southern border, not of the United States, but the southern border of Mexico, which is, of course, the third border of North America and potentially the most important border of North America. Certainly the soft underbelly, a term that Mexicans don't particularly like, but it's absolutely true. Department of Homeland Security is discussing with Mexican authorities about cooperation in terms of technology, expertise, know-how, and even some investment on the southern border between Mexico and Guatemala. That is potentially very, very significant development for the future of border relations in the region. Lastly, integrated databases. The potential for integrating databases, sharing information, will have an impact not just in the fight against terrorism, not just in border management, but also local law enforcement across the region of North America. And this extends way beyond the border, of course. The challenges here are that whereas we're seeing quite high levels of cooperation and information sharing between the three federal governments, information sharing internally between governmental departments and ministries is much less advanced, and many areas of government jealously guard their territories and their interests there. Moving on to the policy recommendations from this paper. There are, in fact, 7 policy recommendations. I've grouped them together here as 6 because I believe that 2 of them go together. Firstly, and I think this is key, and it's something that everybody mentions with regards to Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, is the very real need for impact studies. Full and proper impact studies that focus not just on questions of security, but on identity management, technology, trade, tourism, and privacy. These impact studies need to be conducted independently by federal authorities, also by state and municipal authorities, and they need to be conducted not just independently but jointly as well, in a binational or even tri-national manner. We need to see the development of common policies throughout the region on privacy. What are the sort of the basic minimum standards for privacy within North America? If this is an issue which impacts upon all 3 countries, if we're going to see information sharing internally within countries and across borders, then we need to have some kind of common standards on privacy. Public information, Don has already mentioned that there is still a high level of ignorance and confusion about what Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative actually means. Even in sectors where you would expect people to really know what they're talking about, in the tourism industry, for example, a lot of people still don't really understand what the rules are. People checking in passengers onto airlines in the period leading up to January of this year still didn't really understand what the rules were. Leading up to the implementation of Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative on the land borders, it's important that everybody is informed about what the basic rules are and what it means for them. There has been some improvement. The Zogby poll, or the second Zogby poll that Don mentioned, shows that people are learning about Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, but there are still certain holes in that understanding. Fourthly, a significant investment in border crossing infrastructure. The need to to get the right kind of technology, the right kind of physical infrastructure in place, maybe opening up more lanes for crossing to make the border crossings smoother. There are many places where that's impossible. If you have to go through a tunnel or across a bridge, it's very difficult to add an extra lane. Of course you can. It's very difficult. But in those places, the use of technology will be very, very important to smooth things. And I think it's here that we need to talk about involving the private sector more closely. Public-private partnerships in the area of border crossing management will be crucial here, involving not just their technology but their know-how in terms of identity management. Information exchange and harmonization, I dealt with that. I'll move through that very quickly. Lastly, federal-local cooperation. I think it's implicit here all the way through. I'd like to make a specific and particular reference to Mexico, that when I've spoken to people up on the border, the people in municipal presidencies, in the chambers of commerce, there's an enormous amount of people there who are very, very concerned about what Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative means for them, but they're not receiving any help from the federal authorities. When I spoke to former students of mine who work in consular offices, Mexican consular offices up here in the United States, they said, we are not getting any information. This was back in November of last year. And they said, we don't really know what to tell people because there is a lack of information here. On that basic level, then information sharing between authorities is important. But more importantly than that, I think it's that we need to actually get some people on the ground, on the border in Mexico, to try to find out what the impact is going to be and how that impact can be minimized. And this brings me to the idea of a better Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, which is that, of course, we need to satisfy the security concerns. Everybody involved in the region recognizes that, but we need to minimize the negative impact on people and people's lives. In other words, a better Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, it's not changing the content of Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative as much as its implementation and thinking about the impact of that initiative. Lastly, just a very simple graphic that sums up some of the ideas that we wanted to put forward in this paper, that in order to make Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative a more effective and more successful initiative, of course we need to take interest and be concerned about the implementations for security. It needs to think about how it can best improve efficiency at the border. And we need to think about the dilemma between the questions of privacy and information sharing there. The element which ties these three together, I think, is trilateral cooperation. We've focused mostly on bilateral cooperation thus far. I don't see why it can't be trilateral if there's enough goodwill. And, of course, that's always very, very tricky when you try to persuade Canadians to involve Mexicans in their bilateral relationship with the United States, and the belief that these are very, very different relationships. Anyway, just to sum up, I'd like to say that the paper, as we left it at the end, it's not exhaustive. It doesn't deal with all the fine points, the technical details of WHTI. It does stand there, though, I think, as a provocative document and as something which opens up discussion on this very important issue. Many thanks.
Thank you, Duncan. 2 points on what Duncan talked about. First of all, the unintended positive impact of WHTI on the Mexico-U.S. relationship. One of the issues that we've seen on a regular basis is the fact that Mexicans have always asked to be treated the same way as their Canadian counterparts. And an unintended positive impact is that WHTI starts to balance out how each is treated as they come into the United States. I think the second one, though, is the negative impact of WHTI, or the potential negative impact, as we see the reduction in unemployment, or the increase in unemployment and the reduction of livelihood in the Mexican border towns. Will we, in fact, see a larger percentage of undocumented Mexicans attempting to come into the United States for a better life? So we can discuss those points during the question period. Now, allow me to introduce our first panelist, Catherine Kraninger. Catherine is currently serving as the Director of the Screening Coordination Office at the Department of Homeland Security, in a position to which she was appointed in 2006 by Secretary Chertoff. In this role at the SCO, she is responsible for working to strengthen Homeland Security by enhancing screening processes and technologies in order to facilitate legitimate travel and trade and ensure individual policies and redress opportunities, while to deter, detect, and deny access to and withhold benefits from those individuals who pose a threat to the United States. Previously, Ms. Kraninger was professional staff for Senator Susan Collins, chair of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. Her portfolio with the committee included transportation security, port security, screening programs, privacy, and science and technology. She's worked as a policy advisor to both Secretary Ridge at the Department of Homeland Security and Secretary Mineta at the Department of Transportation. Ms. Kraninger has a Bachelor of Arts from Marquette University and is currently a fourth-year evening student at Georgetown University Law Center. She also has served as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in the Ukraine. Ms. Kraninger?
Thank you, Susan, for the introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I want to thank Drs. Abelson and Wood for their work, obviously the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Fulbright Foundation. We welcome the engagement of the academic community in Homeland Security issues and the responsible discourse that comes from their involvement and from papers such as this one. The topic of the day is obviously the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, but as the paper pointed out, the starting point for this discussion is really border security and September 11th. The 9/11 Commission carefully analyzed the events that led to that terrible day in our nation's history, and several recommendations focused significant attention on the fact that terrorists rely on unsecured networks of travel and trade to move people, money, and weapons between nations to advance their plans. Targeting terrorist travel is a central tenet of the U.S. strategy in the war on terror, and indeed in the international strategy, of which Canada is certainly a partner, and so is Mexico. While none of the 9/11 hijackers came to the United States from Canada, other terrorists have attempted entry in the past. You're welcome. And recent events have shown, unfortunately, that terrorists are active in Canada, most notably the arrest last year of the cell in Toronto. Of course, Canada has not stood still. We want to give them credit where credit is due. They have passed tough anti-terrorism laws and have undertaken prosecution of dangerous terrorists. Canada has been a strong partner in the war on terror and in Homeland Security generally. And the U.S. and Canada are addressing a number of threats together in a layered strategy for a North American perimeter. Those have been widely acknowledged. I would be remiss if I didn't mention them, but I'm not going to focus on them today. But clearly in the area of cargo screening, radiation and nuclear detection, general aviation, small boats, there are obviously a number of things that the U.S. is doing for border security to strengthen our nation's homeland security, and Canada and Mexico are both involved in those things. However, we do have honest differences in approach. As some of Canada's anti-terrorism provisions have expired, the Canadian legislature and the courts are revisiting those measures. Those differences in approach go back farther than 9/11 as well. While both nations have a strong history, a welcoming history of immigration, we have different regimes regarding asylum, refugee, and immigration policies. The U.S. remains concerned about the security implications of our different immigration policies. And though harmonization of these policies has been a long-standing point of discussion between Canada and the U.S., we haven't made a lot of progress on those issues. The U.S. can no longer accept the risk posed by persons entering the country on little more than an oral claim of U.S. or Canadian citizenship, and without sufficiently determining their identity and whether or not they pose a risk. So while our differences are for good reasons, we are compelled by those differences to move forward with WHTI, or Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, WHTI, what have you. The security case has been made. We were pleased by the paper addressing those issues. It is something that tends to get lost in the conversation. And given the great relationship between Canada and the United States, it's certainly not something we wish to tout or discuss openly and broadly. But it is obviously a real issue and a motivation for moving forward. The other side of this, of course, is facilitation. And it's something that is a huge focus in our process to implementation of WHTI. we have, as others have said, a shared border, over 5,500 miles of both land and water, 140 land border crossings, more than $1.4 billion in trade that cross every day, and more than 100 million passengers crossing every year. Our infrastructure is challenged. As many have noted, the investments into those infrastructures, even if we were to undertake them, take a significant period of time. New bridges, new tunnels, international agreements. There are huge, there's a construction timelines. There is a huge amount of effort that has gone in that discussion, and it is certainly a challenge because there is limited infrastructure there. So how can we make sure that as we do look at how we increase our security, how do we make sure that facilitation is part of that? How do we ensure that the communities, particularly those communities at the borders, you talk about what Duncan pointed out with Tijuana, and then northern border communities, which is clearly a focus here, where you have golf courses, libraries, shopping centers on one side of the border or the other, or in fact straddling the border. How do we make sure that the way of life in those communities is, at least the impact on that way of life is mitigated, while at the same time we recognize that there will have to be a change in culture here. There is something that we need to push forward, and that's the change that is going to be reality into the future. I think this is a transitional issue in large part, and I think the paper bore that out as well. There certainly will be a short-term impact as people start to wrap their brains around the change that this is going to mean in their lives. But we certainly believe, and the reason we're pursuing this is that 5 years from now, that will be a distant memory, frankly, and we will have better operations at the borders that will be more efficient as a result of this. Susan pointed out that today at our borders, Customs and Border Protection encounters over 8,000 different documents that are some kind of proof of citizenship, from your Costco card to your voter registration card to whatever you happen to have in your wallet that might demonstrate that you perhaps live in the United States or in Canada. This is really an unacceptable reality. Obviously, you also have, by law, an oral declaration right. If you are indeed a U.S. citizen, you will not be prohibited from entering the United States. So we have that challenge. So what are the documents that can be acceptable proof of identity and citizenship, as WHTI requires, and how do we ensure that individuals who do want to cross the border, whether it is daily for their for business purposes, for shopping purposes, or whether it's that spontaneous travel or college student that decides to go down for the day, how do we make sure that those individuals have the documents that they need to make sure that we don't impact adversely that trade and that travel? So we are really pushing forward with this to make sure that we have alternative documents that are available. I'll leave to the Department of State and Ann Barrett, my partner here in WHTI implementation, the discussion on the passport card and what the State Department is doing on that front. But we obviously are also looking at a number of other documents that would be available to people based on their choice. We have considered, as Congress has directed and as others have suggested, the cost of the document to the average citizen. What is the cost of getting that document to ensure that it's something they can have easy access to, that they can, proceed as they would today, or at least with a minor change in their general operations to get a document that will be the right document. I think the best example of that is the Memorandum of Agreement that Secretary Chertoff signed with Governor Gregoire of Washington State. We are moving forward with enhanced driver's licenses. Washington State's been a fantastic partner. They are going to be issuing on a voluntary basis to those residents of Washington State who wish to apply for an enhanced driver's license, $15 over the cost of getting their driver's license, and it will be a document that both denotes identity and citizenship with some improved issuance procedures that are consistent with Real ID, and that also includes the RFID vicinity chip that we're putting in the passport card. And that is clearly the direction that the Department of Homeland Security is moving on all of its travel documents. So we are moving forward with that technology to ensure that we can facilitate border crossing. We do have a huge investment, both in the President's FY08 budget and in a reprogramming that is on the Hill right now to start moving forward with the planning for this infrastructure investment. But we do intend to deploy RFID vicinity readers at the top 39 ports of entry, both northern and southern border, recognizing that, again, this is an issue for facilitating the crossing of U.S. citizens on the southern border, as well as Mexican citizens. And Anne may mention as well that the border crossing card in the future will incorporate this technology. So we are, again, saying we recognize that trade and travel will continue to increase. It certainly always has, and it will continue. And we have to do what we can to manage, with our limited infrastructure, that movement of goods and people that are legitimate. And the other side of this, obviously, too, is our ability to target those who are of concern. And how do we do that? Well, first, we have to have at least an identity they're claiming. If there is a document requirement for everyone, then that again starts to focus down on what is the identity that the individual is presenting, and are there any suspicions that the CBP officer has based on the person in front of them and based on the information that they have in the database, because now they are more able to actually do wants and warrants checks and checks against the terrorist screening database. So those things are going to be happening real time as well as we start to deploy this technology. We recognize, too, that Congress directed a number of areas that we believe are important for responsible implementation of WHTI in the DHS Appropriations Act of 2006. Most notably, they expected that we would look at alternative procedures for minors. And we have gone, I believe, above and beyond that. The Secretary announced in February that not only will we have an alternative process for groups of children who are traveling, Canadian and U.S. children who are traveling, but also for individual children who are traveling under the age of 16. In some discussions with the State Department and within the administration, we decided that based on the risk and based on the issuance of a 10-year passport at age 16, that was an appropriate cutoff to say that children under the age of 16 would be able to travel with somewhat different procedures. They would not have to have a passport or a passport card. Certainly they could have one if they wanted one or had one already, but that they would be able to travel with their birth certificate as an alternative. And certainly that's something that they have already. We recognize that that is not a population that we want to focus our attention on. It's certainly a population that poses some challenges when you talk about school buses and other teams and crossings that are routine, and the cost, frankly, too, to families as they're looking at traveling either to Mexico or to Canada, and looking at the cost for a family of 4 or 5 or 6 of deciding to take that trip. So how can we mitigate the impact of that cost? And certainly an alternative procedure for children is a way to do that. We will obviously move forward with our rulemaking that will announce alternative documents. I've already talked about the enhanced driver's license pilots. We expect there to be more than one, actually, which I did not mention. Washington State, obviously, is proceeding. We are moving forward to talk to a number of other states that have expressed interest, and I'm happy to talk about that further. We also are going to accept and continue to promote applications for our trusted traveler programs. Nexus, Fast, and Sentry are going to be acceptable documents under WHTI, and we are putting that into the rulemaking process. Clearly, we'll have to take comment on that, but I don't imagine too much opposition to that point, and we hope that more people will apply for that. And as a last point, Canadian and Mexican consultation is obviously something that is a key part of WHTI implementation and that is directed by Congress. And we have proceeded with both fronts, really. It sounds like we may have to do a little better job, I think, on the Mexican side, but it is certainly something that we use and communicate with them about on a regular basis. On the Canadian side, as others have noted, they are a more highly documented population in terms of passport holding, but we are working with the Canadian government on alternative documents. We would have welcomed their moving forward with a passport card-like document. They have decided not to do that. We are talking to them about enhanced driver's licenses or other documents that they have available to their citizens, anything that would denote citizenship and identity as required by law. And those discussions are ongoing, are substantive. We're encouraged by our recent conversations and certainly expect some movement on that front as well. So we recognize that this is clearly a joint issue that we have to deal with together to make sure that everyone who would like to enter the United States is properly documented. I think just as a closing point, we really do have a good partnership with the federal entities involved. We appreciate the support of the academic community, the 9/11 Commission as well, which I know Susan will talk more extensively about their findings and involvement. We are moving forward with Canada and Mexico on WHTI implementation. We recognize that this is a major cultural change in the way that we approach the Canadian border, the joint Canadian-U.S. border. But we are still committed to moving forward with it and implementing in a responsible way. I think the air rule implementation, which was touched on very briefly, is a precursor that we would like everyone to hold in their minds as we move forward with land implementation. We were very clear in our public messaging. Public outreach is a huge part of what we have to do in the coming months as we move into 2008 and we move into implementation of WHTI. We will be implementing what is a pretty rigorous discussion on that point in terms of going to border communities and getting the message out and explaining to people what the documents are that are available. So all of that will start this summer. That is a huge part of our strategy to implement WHTI and something we recognize we must do and will do moving forward. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. We'll take